Though we rarely hear talk of a religious left today, in the 1960s and 70s, there was an active and vibrant set of voices advocating for progressive policies from across the faith spectrum. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I talk with Dr. L. Benjamin Rolsky about how Carter fit into that historical moment and the lessons we can learn about the relationship between faith, politics, and popular culture.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
The time for racial discrimination is over.
That I will faithfully execute
an undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
The office of President of the United States.
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
And will, to the best of my ability,
It is a crisis of confidence.
preserve, protect, and defend
To remove the light of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I would have.
the Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
My name is Benji Rolsky, and I am a affiliated fellow at the Center for Cultural Analysis at Rutgers University.
And you're also the author of a book, The Rise and Fall of the Religious Left, Politics, Television, and Popular Culture in the 1970s and Beyond. So this is the Carter era. How does Carter figure into your book, into your research?
Wonderful question. So my book, The Rise and Fall of the Religious Left, came out in 2019, dissertating as Trump was arising. So in some ways, I'm kind of proud of the fact that he doesn't really appear anywhere in the text. But the 70s of the moment, 70s are so fascinating to me. This kind of transition from, if you want, some sense of optimism to maybe a sense of malaise and despair, especially as we get to the mid 70s. Carter, of course, gets caught up in that, tries to sort of overcome it in his own way, obviously bringing his own kind of style. As far as how he fits into my book, Carter is part of a broader formation that we could call the religious left. My own work looked at Norman Lear and Judaism and civic pride and writing letters to presidents and protecting religious minorities and preventing discrimination. Carter is going to fit into this because in some ways, as far as the presidency is concerned, I think I saw this in one of the previous episodes. He's arguably one of the most Christian presidents we've ever had, depending on how you define that.
To whatever degree something like that is definable.
Absolutely. It's tongue in cheek because in some ways it's coming from a sense of what we mean by that over and against something else. He's such a powerful and provocative figure in the sense that the Oval Office is in some ways a stepping stone to something else. And in some ways, that's kind of how he fits in the sense that he's a Baptist. He's teaching Sunday school for all of these years. He embodies what I would say is a social gospel kind of ethic that you get from that tradition. So if I were to expand it out, especially at that time, Carter is instrumental in, I suppose, really profound ways and somewhat ironic ways at the same time. In some ways, he has so much trouble with Ronald Reagan because he uses the word families instead of family in the late 1970s. So in some ways, his own inclusivity and kind of awareness of diversity and awareness of, because that's what the religious left is. It's more of a cacophonous movement. It's very diverse. It's just really understood or seen as Christian from the outside. So Carter in some ways kind of embodies what we would mean by this term, even though it's kind of under fire in the mid to late 70s, and Lear's doing his best to uphold it, and Carter's being defeated. So people for the American way appear. How do we hold on to this? And in some ways, that's kind of trying what the book is trying to get at. But yeah, Carter would fit seamlessly into this time period as part of this kind of wider movement that's trying to voice itself coming out of the 60s, crashing and burning a little bit, going through Watergate. How does a religious left even articulate itself in that moment? So it was challenging.
It feels so foreign right now to even use the term religious left, right? This is way out of our discourse now. Surely there was contestation over such things even in Carter's time, but were the stakes as high? Was there just more room? How has this changed so dramatically to the point where today we don't even really have a visible religious left in many ways in American public life?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. So, I mean, I guess that's the second half of the book, kind of like the rise and fall. And it's funny you say that because, I mean, you're right. There is an emptiness. There is a sort of vacuousness depending on what you're looking at, where you're coming from as far as any kind of presence when it comes to that. To be honest, actually, like I can recall, at least within the last maybe 4, 5, 6 years, I mean, in some sense, William Barber and Yale Divinity School and these kind of centers have really tried to mobilize something. And I mean, in some ways, it's a lack of imagination. There's an assumption that if we happen to find a figure of faith and put him out in front of the movement, that'll work. I mean, when my book was coming out, there were 2 or 3 books on the religious left. So there was a moment, in some ways, why or where has it gone? What's the deal now? In some ways, the fascination and the consternation and the frustration over something like Christian nationalism, it has kind of like taken a lot of the focus and emphasis away from that movement. Even though if you track these sorts of things, there are conferences and there are meetings with scholars, academic pundits, people in the world, activists who are meeting and they're doing these sorts of things, but it's kind of like over and against Christian nationalism, over and against onslaught on the horizon. So if I were to kind of read it, was there more room? Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, part of my attention to religious left, I mean, I chose Norman Lear for a reason because he wasn't Christian. And I didn't necessarily choose him because he was Jewish necessarily either. It was more like, this is how I stand religious liberal kind of activism to be happening, which is through culture and through television and through popular culture. Not to mention the fact that former president who made a spectacle, of course, with the Bible in public and that whole kind of pageantry. You ask about room in some ways. Yeah, there's very little room now. It's kind of ironic. I'd say 2, 3 years ago, I could find you all these things, these books, like My Thing, all these articles. There was a moment, but you're right. The last year and a half or so, even more, it's been virtually silent.
Yeah.
I think you're right about that.
The space of religious discourse has really been colonized by one side, and they've kind of taken up that banner. And I'd be interested to hear how you think that people of faith that have a different orientation, even if it's not necessarily liberal, even if they would just see it as maybe sane or reasonable.
Yeah.
What are some of the touch points in history that we can look at where more progressive faith movements have been successful, both culturally and politically?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, I guess my second book, or what I want to try and do with the second one, is look at how in certain moments in time, what we kind of understand as common sense, whether it's about religion or politics, the relationship between the two, those begin to shift. And it's really tectonic and it's really big, trying to get at it. I do some comparative work with Thatcher's England, comparing kind of the late 70s, early 80s of our country with that. To me, it's a lot about given moments, sort of environment, what we value, how we treat each other. In some ways, we're living in a very coarse, kind of heavily mediated time. The moment lends itself to certain types of activism, and then it might not lend itself to certain type of activism. So, moments would be like the social gospel, obviously the New Deal, to some degree, like the 1960s, obviously. Like if we're looking at however we're defining this as liberal or progressive, I wouldn't say Lear's progressive. I would say a lot of this stuff is kind of liberal, which just has its certain connotations today. I mean, if anything, like that word means so many different things today, and sort of unpacking it, kind of like the history and the different meanings. So, I mean, we have the early 20th century, we have sort of the 1960s, and it's had to do with what tools and tactics and methods do you use to mobilize and to get your sort of the word out. And historically, progressive people have used different kind of forms of culture to do that. Somewhat effectively, we watch All in the Family for a decade, hopefully we become a better country. Did that happen? Did that not happen? Kind of like that's the sort of leap of faith, I suppose, that left liberal kind of activism assumes. Seen some things recently about power. How do liberal progressive people understand power, claim power, defend power? That's a much bigger question and much more debatable one in the sense of the left or progressive kind of movements like this see themselves ultimately as being somewhat prophetic and calling something out. Things are different now. I think we see everything now. I think what's been fascinating to see is this whole weird kind of thing. Like that's been very interesting. Like I wrote a piece on conservative uses of direct mail and how direct mail has really revolutionized the country since the 70s. Not like it's new technology. It's just that, that's another thing I would say, like kind of a resistance to technology sometimes, a resistance kind of to doing the things that the other side,
Right.
the means, the tools. But these things are very old.
Yeah.
These sorts of like conversations have been going on since like the 60s and 70s.
And that's what I mean by like a colonized mindset. It's like in a lot of ways on liberal channels now, like we don't talk about religion or faith at all. Like that's what they do over there.
Yeah.
And I really wonder about the efficacy of that a lot. I'm interested to talk a little bit more about this relationship between politics and culture. What are some of the lessons you've learned? Carter so famously leveraged popular culture with the interest from Rolling Stone journalist Hunter S. Thompson to having, the Allman Brothers play fundraiser concerts. He would later say the Allman Brothers basically put us in the White House. Carter didn't necessarily ride that wave of popular culture through his presidential term, especially in the way that some other presidents have. But there's got to be some lessons, probably both positive and negative, to learn there from this relationship between politics and culture.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So some lessons. Isn't it funny? His whole sort of campaign was almost torpedoed before he even got started through culture. Have the stirring of the heart, just being very honest. And what happened to that, obviously. Yeah, hearing that, I also think to myself, some of the lessons, some of the pitfalls and some of the lessons. So Carter's writing that, the show is politics, which I really enjoyed very much. So then where I come back into this is Carter's defeated, Reagan's elected. And then our friend Lear comes back into the picture and does this variety show called I Love Liberty. Because Falwell was doing I Love America campaigns throughout the 70s, and Lear is now fighting back. They've lost. Reagan has become president. So now this is kind of like not like a last ditch effort, but this is sort of like, I'm going to leverage everything I can about culture, Hollywood, society, everything in order to get this done. Now, first of all, like heavily relying so much on culture is something that I think we should think about a little bit more critically. I think we can get a little bit too comfortable. We turn on Jon Stewart, who's returned to the television and everything's the way that it was. Talk about nostalgia. Kind of interesting, right? So part of it is you can't be too dependent. Not everyone is Norman Lear. Not everyone can do satire like him. In some ways, the children of Lear are Family Guy and South Park. Both of those shows embody the satirical complexity that Lear offered to the country. Just because you have a late night television show doesn't mean you can do the news in the same way as kind of all these other individuals and articulate the same kind of political substance. You enact it, you use it, you mobilize it, knowing that it's not necessarily going to be everything. So this I Love Liberty, it was amazing. It had Gregory Hines, it had Robin Williams, it had Mary Tyler Moore, it had Big Bird, it had The Muppet. It was the most unbelievable, spectacular variety show you could possibly imagine, which is wonderful. Now, who comes out from behind the curtain is Mr. Barry Goldwater. And Mr. Barry Goldwater comes out and Lear asks Goldwater, can you do a bit? Can you do like a punchline for this variety show? So he comes out, he does the punchline. It's a great evening. It's a wonderful occasion. I don't know the efficacy of that. You sort of have to know what you're doing. So, we see Kamala Harris, we see some culture things happening. We see some fundraiser things happening. that's on the cutting edge. It's young. All in the Family was young, to demographics, trying to get young people interested in the issues today. It's a very diverse and substantive toolkit. You just have to make sure that you follow it up with mobilizing, going out into the world and sort of hearing what we're hearing from the, Harris campaign or different campaigns about actually like, okay, what do we have to do now? So sort of lessons and pitfalls. It's a wonderful tool. It's a wonderful way of meeting people and reaching people. At the same time, you have to be very careful, especially if you use satire, because I think satire has been an incredible tool. But in these sorts of days, satire can be very tricky. So part of it is go for it, mobilize, leverage, get the message out, but also realize that cameos and shows and culture might not necessarily do all of it. But beyond that, it's a wonderful set of tools, an array of ways of getting to people.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to think about is what is the substance that follows the flash and also the unpredictability, right? Like if we look at the running mate for the liberal opposition, J.D. Vance, whose public career really came to the fore on the back of a book that many people like myself who come from whether the South or Appalachia didn't really appreciate from the beginning, but Hollywood really jumped on board, made a movie about it. And now we have this unintended consequence of him ascending to the vice presidential nomination. So these things are really, really unpredictable. And I really like that point of you can't stake but so much on them.
Maybe just to add one more little thing. So this thing I did on direct mail and marketing, I have this wonderful quote, something like, marketers from the 70s, early 80s, liberals and conservatives discovered the same tool at the same time. And there's wonderful turn of phrase I have says, whatever we mean by these terms, but like the left used direct mail to raise money, the right uses direct mail to move the country. So to me, as long as we, I don't know if you remember, but Pelosi and others were getting shellacked for the direct mail that would go out. I don't know if you remember, maybe a year or two ago, it was very crass and it would go on and on and on. And the text messages and people were making fun of it on social media. So it's out there. Direct mail was something that was discovered by both. So as long as you kind of tether it all together, as long as you have like a marketing campaign, you're also doing that in culture. There's nothing about policy. There's nothing about kind of anything. The direct mail is the substance. Now, obviously, you're hopefully not scaring people into oblivion, even though that's kind of the tradition of it. Kind of like infotainment. I argue it's kind of like what we have today about 50 years ago, where we have all of this. So that's the only thing I would add is just has to be multidimensional. That's all. Like, don't just look to William Barber or Bill Maher or, Jon Stewart or some person. It's great and we're all artists and everything, but also like we need some substance. Politics is about power, especially cultural production and the power over cultural production. Like that's the big thing I talked about is like, that's power. And there were 3 networks in the 70s. So that was the big platform. That's hundreds of millions of people a week. So just a little bit of perspective.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing your perspective on the show. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.